And sometimes, once in a while, you'll be eating breakfast and you'll go,
So unfortunately, this video is coming from a place of ignorance when it comes to the pronomian understanding of the Bible, which is why in my Bible study groups, we're going over the Gospel of Matthew and how its structure and the text itself inherently support a pronomian view. Matthew's 5 discourses immediately stand out to me as parallel to the Torah in its 5 books. So, in the book of Matthew, we see the Sermon on the Mount, the missionary discourse, the parabolic discourse, the community discourse, as well as the Olivet discourse. Much like the Torah has Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Some pastors will agree that this is an interesting observation and then immediately point out that within this dispensation, it is no longer necessary to observe the laws of Moses. But this conclusion is non sequitur and deeply flawed. It does not follow that this parallel simply exists to invalidate the law of Moses when Jesus explicitly says in Matthew chapter 5 verses 17 through 20 that he came not to do away with the law or the prophets, that not a single letter, not a single iota, not even the smallest yud would pass away until all things are fulfilled. And when he says all things, he means the passing away of heaven and earth, so it's qualified just in that statement. In fact, the book of Matthew presents Jesus as the one like Moses in the first 4 chapters. For example, both Moses and Jesus were under the threat of a death penalty by Pharaoh and Herod respectively when they were very young. Secondly, they were called out of Egypt. Mary and Joseph took Jesus to Egypt, and Moses was removed from Egypt with the Israelites. Thirdly, Jesus was tested in the wilderness for 40 days, whereas Moses was tested in the wilderness with the Israelites for 40 years. Then they both delivered God's law from a mountain, Moses from Sinai, and Yeshua on the mount where he gave the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if Jesus was trying to invalidate the Torah in Matthew chapter 5, then it wouldn't make sense at all for him to quote the Torah against Satan himself when tempted in the wilderness in the chapter prior. For example, he specifically invokes Deuteronomy chapter 8, where it says, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." Now, up to that point, every word that proceeded out of the mouth of God was contained in the law, the prophets, and the writings. In other words, in this statement, Jesus was affirming 2 things: that men needed edible foods for their general sustenance, but that they needed the Torah, the prophets, and the writings for their spiritual sustenance. Furthermore, later in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus claims that the summation of all the Torah and the prophets is to do unto your neighbor as you would have them do unto you. Now, this precedes the Golden Rule by a long time. The Golden Rule isn't some marvelous, genius, secular innovation. Rather, it's Jesus' words characterizing the entire law and God's commandments into one specific statement, meaning he is not invalidating the commandments, but he is saying that the commandments serve as a proper protocol to achieve that. Another example from the gospel is when a man who is leprous comes into contact with Yeshua, and Yeshua tells him to go and make an animal sacrifice as a thanksgiving offering to God for the fact that he was healed. So Yeshua not only validates the entirety of written Torah that doesn't involve the priesthood, he also validates the priesthood, and when he said he wasn't going to nullify any aspect of the law, he was extremely serious in that claim. And many Messianics and Christians share in their desire to abrogate the priesthood because they don't understand that the majority of the priesthood sacrifices had absolutely nothing to do with sin, And secondly, they don't understand that even the sin sacrifices involved were for purification purposes on a temporal basis and not to make eternal atonement. So the priesthood and Yeshua serve two completely different functions, but they don't compete against one another. And that's very much what people have been taught. So if they were instead taught to understand that most of the sacrifices in Leviticus were thanksgiving offerings and not offerings for sin, as well as the fact that Yeshua can be the temple symbolically, that we can be the temple, and that there can also be a literal temple standing in Jerusalem, and that none of those things compete against each other, at least in the spiritual sense, then we can come to a fully complete theology that makes sense all across the Bible, starting from Genesis and ending in Revelation. Something that goes to further the pronomian understanding is the fact that later in Matthew chapter 8, when Jesus came across a demon-possessed man, the demons that were in him said, "Let us go into the swine," which is very significant because in the Torah, swine are tameh, or unclean. Now note, in the Torah, we do not see the word kosher, which is why kosher is something completely different. We're purely talking about something that is Levitically unclean. And this is important. The demons didn't ask, hey, let us go into cows, let us go into sheep, let us go into a lamb, let us go into a chicken, none of that. It might just point out this intentional thematic grouping that Matthew intends to insinuate, which is that unclean spirits belong in unclean beings. If the host is unclean, then all Jesus is doing is sending defilement to defilement. In other words, this provides the exact kind of insight we need to show how first century Jewish Christians viewed the pig. To add to that, in Matthew chapter 7, we see Jesus telling people who come to him, who have prophesied in his name, who have cast out demons in his name, and done many works in his name, to depart from him. Why? Because of their anomia. Now in Greek, anomia specifically means somebody who is without law. It's not just a vacuum or some random anarchic state. Specifically, it is rebellion to the laws of God. Anomia is also the word that gets used in the Greek Septuagint, which is basically the Greek translation of the Old Testament, for examples where people were rebellious specifically against God's law in the first 5 books. In other words, people might be prophesying in his name, but he says to do the will of the Father, which is the commandments that are contained in the first 5 books. Now, if people are prophesying in his name and abrogating and doing away with Torah, then that makes them a false prophet, according to Deuteronomy chapter 13. Now, what you notice in many of the churches where people are prophesying in his name or casting out demons in his name, i.e. the Catholic Church, there's plenty of exorcism. They have statues, they have icons, they have other images and symbols that they worship and focus on instead of the God of Israel. So if they're claiming to invoke the Messiah's name, but they're engaged in a worship system that's deviating away from the worship of the God of Israel, then that inherently makes them false prophets, and their miracles are also false. And finally, just for this video finally, not finally as a whole, because there's plenty of more ground to cover in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gives the 11 the Great Commission, where he tells the disciples to go into the nations, teaching them everything he has commanded them. Well, in Matthew chapter 5, he commanded them not to think that he came to do away with the Torah or the prophets. So if we're going to remain logically and internally consistent, if the disciples went out into the nations teaching that Jesus had abrogated the law, they would be acting specifically against the commandment that he gave in Matthew chapter 28, which is to teach them everything that he taught them, which means go to the 4 corners of the earth and teach them about written Torah, make disciples of them. You teach them written Torah in a discipleship relationship, and you also, and first and foremost, baptize them in my name. Hopefully this helps. Shalom.